I once saw the sole of my father's boot fall off right in the middle of the yard, and he simply bent down, picked it up, and quietly kept walking like nothing had happened. For some reason, that image has stuck with me ever since. It was a late afternoon in early winter. The sky had turned gray and the ground was muddy and patchy after the rain from the night before. My father had just stepped out from under the porch when the sole of his left boot completely came off, making a sad little ripping sound. There was no glue left, and the material had gotten too weak to hold onto the boot anymore. All that remained was the worn-out inner lining, soaked through and faded. I stood there in the doorway, eyes wide, but my father never looked back. He just bent down, picked up the fallen sole, slipped it into the pocket of his jacket, and kept walking. The sound of his heels tapping on the cement echoed dry and sharp, one step at a time, as if nothing mattered more than just finishing that familiar walk. That pair of boots, he had worn them for almost 20 years. I'm going to tell you the story of those boots, not because they were anything special, but because they were so incredibly ordinary. The kind of boots everyone has probably seen at some point in their lives. But the way a father wore them, all the way until the sole came off, carried a whole lifetime inside. A kind of love that had no show, no words, and no need to be seen by anyone. Do you remember what your father used to wear for years without ever letting go? If you do, tell that story, because someone out there might also be remembering an old pair of boots, a jacket, or a hammer they never got the chance to hold on to. I still remember the biting cold of winter mornings in our small Ohio town when the chill would sneak through every thin window crack and leave a misty film on the glass like a layer of fog. The house would still be quiet filled, only with the low hum of the heater and the dry ticking of the kitchen clock. And in that silence, one sound always came right on time like an old habit: the faint scuff of my father's boots on the wooden floor, dragging slow and deep, like every step carried the weight of a long day that had not even started. My father always woke before dawn. The alarm had not gone off yet, but he was already up the wooden bed, creaking with a familiar sound. I could hear his breathing, slow and steady, like someone testing the cold in their chest. He made his way to the kitchen, flipped on the yellow light that spilled dimly over the scratched wooden table. My mother was still asleep, but every night she would leave the coffee pot ready when my dad opened the plastic lid. It clicked softly, and the smell of weak coffee mixed with dry wood and a bit of leftover smoke from the night before. I often woke at that hour, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to listen. The house seemed to have its own rhythm when my father entered the kitchen. The sound of his jacket brushing the wooden chair, the crackle of the fire in the stove, then the soft scrape of the chair being pulled out as he sat down. On the shelf, the old tin box with screws and a tube of glue always sat side by side just under the calendar with a photo of a golden field. That calendar had a stubby pencil tucked into the corner and a note in my mother's handwriting: "Bring the thick gloves." These little things blended into a picture so simple I never thought I would miss it one day. The boots lay in the corner of the kitchen right where the yellow light barely reached. The brown leather had faded to a moldy gray. The toes were scuffed raw from scraping against rocks, and the soles were cracked like maps of all the roads he had walked. My father pulled the chair closer, lifted each boot onto his knee, and brushed off the fine dust left from the day before. He turned the boot in his hands and gave it a quick once-over. the kind of glance that comes from knowing every rip, every frayed seam by heart, but still checking anyway like part of a ritual. I stood in my bedroom doorway, peeking through the crack. The kitchen light outlined a thin glow around the shoulders of his flannel shirt. The dark, checkered fabric had faded, and the elbows had grown shiny and worn. He leaned down, slipped his hand inside the boot, and straightened the tongue that was fraying at the edges. I could hear the sound of dry leather rubbing against his sleeve, even the soft pop of the old laces as he pulled them tight. His index finger had a small crack by the nail, the kind that bled a little when the air got too dry. Every morning he still used that same finger to cinch the knot. Always tight. At the time, I had no idea he was heading to a 12-hour shift at the rock quarry. I did not realize it then. Back then, I just thought my father had no special job, just work like every other grown-up in town. I had no idea that hidden in the smell of old leather were traces of limestone engine oil and the silent cold from beneath the ground. My father never rushed. He would lift the boot, tilt it slightly to check the sole. Sometimes he ran his thumbnail along a crack. The scrape sounded like a quiet sigh. Then he would slip his foot in the heel, pressing into a sole so thin you could see the stitching beneath. I heard a faint squish as the air escaped. He rotated his ankle once, settling the fabric into place, then tied the laces through this hole around that one pull tight and tie the knot. His knots always looked the same, neat, low, never bulky like everything else about him. Outside the window, the yard was covered in a thin layer of frost. The wooden steps had rims of ice reflecting the yellow light into faint little specks. I breathed in, and the cold stung my nose. My father stood up, grabbed the coffee thermos, slipped it into his large coat pocket, the lid clinking against the metal button. He reached for the knit cap hanging on a wooden peg, tapped it lightly against the edge of the cabinet to shake off a few specks of dust, and pulled it on. The door opened and a gust of wind swept in, carrying the smell of damp moss and the cold iron of the door handle. He stepped outside. His boots hit the porch steps. 1, 2, 3. Each step was a low, heavy sound. He paused for a beat, patted his jacket pocket like checking for his keys. Then he walked on his figure, blending into the pale morning light. The road ahead was lined with wide snow tracks from the plow the night before. At the edges, white rock salt stones, clumped like table salt. Through the wind, I could still hear the steady rhythm of his boots on the pavement, steady enough to count. One morning, he left his boots in the kitchen longer than usual. He had taken the insoles out and placed them near the heater. Curious, I walked over after he had stepped outside. The insoles were not store-bought. They were strips of old newspaper carefully cut and folded in half for thickness. The print had faded from sweat. I could still make out a headline, "Gas prices rise." Then the rest blurred away. In the corner there was a date more than 10 years ago. I froze, touching the soft, wilted edge of the paper. It felt like I was touching his footsteps that had passed through time without a sound. After that day, I started noticing more. On the left sole, near the deepest crack, there was a smudge of dried glue stretching like a crooked stitch. The heel tilted slightly inward, worn unevenly, which made the left boot's sound always a bit lower than the right. When he walked around the house, the rhythm became a pattern. Thud, tap, thud, tap. The two beats sounded almost the same, but not quite, as if he were hiding a slight limp no one ever noticed. That winter, the kitchen smelled like many things: coffee damp wool from his hat, old leather from the boots, and leftover laundry soap on the dish towel. My mother hung her apron near the stove, and its cloth ties whispered against the cabinet door when the wind blew through. By the sink, a small brown burn mark the size of a coin remained on the counter, a scar from the time the coffee pot overflowed. I used to call it the kitchen's birthmark. In the early morning light, it would glisten faintly. All those little things that once meant nothing were the first to knock on the door of my memory later on. At the time, I had no idea he was heading to a 12-hour shift at the rock quarry. That sentence played again in my head when I saw dried mud flakes crumble off his heels, gray dust scratching into the carpet like chalk. One morning just before leaving, he stopped and gently touched an old black and white photo hanging on the wall. It showed him standing beside a long-lost truck with a deep quarry in the background. His cracked hand rested on the younger version of himself in the photo just for a second, like a silent greeting to the past. One snowy morning, I saw my brother Tom shuffle into the kitchen, still half asleep. He looked at the boots, then at Dad. "Let me drive you," he offered, voice raspy. Dad waved him off. "Save the gas," he said. Tom scratched his head, then pulled a small roll of laces from his pocket. He bent down and replaced the worn heel lace. No one spoke. The only sound was the new lace sliding through the eyelets. Shh, louder than usual in that quiet kitchen. That morning when Dad stepped onto the porch, the thud tap of his boots sounded sharper, like someone had just tuned a heartbeat. Another time, freezing rain turned the yard to glass. Dad pulled a tin box from the shelf filled with small metal studs. Using pliers, he tapped them gently into the soles for grip. I sat watching light flashing off the nails. He said, "Just enough to hold on." I nodded, not quite understanding, but loving how hold on sounded practical but meaningful in every way. One morning, the radio crackled out. Wind warnings. The announcer rushed through a blizzard alert, urging folks to stay home. Dad still got up, tied his boots, just added a second pair of socks. Then he reached out and switched the radio off mid-sentence. Silence filled the kitchen. In that stillness, I heard him sniffle from the cold, and a soft cough he tried to stifle like a cough, asking permission, not complaining. Once after he'd left, I picked up a boot. Tucked under the tongue was a slip of cardboard the size of 2 fingers. With Mom's handwriting, "Do not forget lunch." The blue ink had smudged where the paper got damp. I stood there holding it. In our home, care was rarely spoken. It was folded quietly into the warmest part of his day, inside his boots. Sometimes he forgot things. A short pencil behind the spice rack, a tag for the quarry gate, and came back inside. His boots left wet prints on the floor. I'd rush with a cloth, dabbing until the spots faded like soft halos. Once he found what he needed, he'd nod, offer a flickering smile, then go. The door would close with a rubbery squeak, and the kitchen would return to the warmth of the stove and the empty chair. Some mornings I'd sit still, waiting to hear Mr. Harlan's truck down the street that meant Dad had made it to the main road. I liked how all the sounds fit together: kettle ping, radio static, lace scraping door, creaking. Then the truck engine starting, like the whole neighborhood was waking to a rhythm Dad never realized he set. I didn't understand how one man could become the clock for a house, a street, an entire childhood. At the time, I had no idea he was heading to a 12-hour shift at the rock quarry. Not until I stood for 8 hours at my warehouse job, my back aching, did I understand what each of his steps meant. I imagined the underground cold, the drilling echoing through his bones, sweat soaking into the newspaper soles, and every night the boots sat by the door, mud cracking like dry clay. Now that same sentence carries the chill of morning air, the glow of kitchen light, the pull of laces. It puts me right back in my old spot, standing in the doorway, watching a man bend to tie a knot with deep care. Have you ever woken early just to hear a sound from your father, the keys, the shoes, the door? Share your story? Someone out there might be listening for that sound too. The next morning, the radio warned of days of steady rain. Dirt roads would turn to slush. I looked at the boots near the heater and thought of the squishy sound they'd make on the porch. I suddenly understood that some rainy seasons do not just soak rooftops, they seep into people's hearts. That summer, the rain didn't fall in bursts. It drizzled endlessly like someone had left a faucet barely open. Every day the sky hung in dull gray, no sun, no wind. Just thick humidity clinging to everything from doorknobs to damp towels. The porch stayed wet, spotted like the skin of a river fish. The smell of damp earth crept up the steps, mixing with the scent of swollen wood. The front door groaned on its hinges as if even it was tired. Afternoons darkened early. Around 4, the sky-dimmed leaves dripped, waiting for a breeze to knock the water free. I crouched on the porch, tracing puddles with a stick, guiding paper boats. I had built a dirt dam to protect a dry patch I scrubbed clean that morning. Mom had asked me to do a chore. And almost like a cue, I'd hear it squelch. 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 Dad's boots soaked through returning. He stepped up the porch each stair, letting out a soaked thud. Mud trailed behind, streaking the concrete. I watched it wash through my dam, flooding the clean patch and sinking my paper boat. It happened often, and every time my young heart stung with innocent frustration. In just a few steps, my work was undone. Dad said nothing. He knocked his heels on the step, shaking off the mud. The thuds echoed like a boat's hull. Rain traced lines down his soaked shirt. Mom came from the kitchen with a worn towel laid an old brown felt mat beneath him. It used to say, "Welcome," but the letters were faded. "Put them here," she whispered gently, like trying not to wake the wind. Dad lifted his foot. The squelch turned into a slow slosh as the boot met the wet felt. I leaned forward, stuck my stick in front of the trail like building a fence to protect what was left. Dad glanced at me just for a second, no apology in his eyes. Just a half step back, diverting the mud toward the drain. A small gesture. If you blinked, you'd miss it. But to me, it was a quiet way of yielding. Still, I was not ready to let go. "I just cleaned that," I muttered. Mom tilted her head, did not scold me. Just placed the towel near my feet, as if to say, "Hand it here, I'll clean." I did not hand it over. I wanted to hold on to that feeling a little longer, that this porch belonged to me. Rain continued trickling down the gutter. Water and mud flowed into a thin stream covering the boot prints, with a sheen like oil. Dad sniffled and brushed the edge of his mud-splashed pant leg. Tiny drops of mud flew up, landing on the toe of my shoe, cold and sudden. He bent down and took off one boot. The sound of it slipping off was like someone pulling a bottle out of a bucket of water, a soft, resisting pop. His thick sock left a wet imprint on the mat. Then he switched feet. The boots stood with their toes touching like two animals whispering to each other. He picked them up, tilted them slightly, and rainwater from the soles trickled out into the yard. Drip, drip, drip. You could count the drops. Mom slid 2 layers of old folded newspaper under the boots. Not for padding, I will not speak of that again, but to stop the water from spreading across the floor. I frowned and asked, "Why didn't you take them off outside in the exact way a kid would complain about something that no longer matters?" Dad said nothing. He gripped the door frame and stepped in. Creak. The door answered for him. Mom handed me a bucket of warm water. "Wipe a little more, okay?" Her voice was as light as saying, "Add another plate to the table." I swallowed the words. "It's his fault," stuck in my throat and let them dissolve into the smell of rain and wet cement. Back then I thought those boots were the dirtiest thing in the house until I grew up and realized they were in fact the cleanest clean in the quiet, unspeakable way of a father's love. From then on, every squelch on the porch carried new meaning. But before I understood that, I went through many frustrating afternoons. On the third rainy Tuesday, Dad came home late. The yard looked like a gray mirror. I had scrubbed the porch for over 30 minutes, the smell of cheap soap sharp in my nose. Dad stepped in. Mud stretched behind him like a trail. I snatched the rag from Mom's hand. "Let me," and I scrubbed. Scrubbed in anger as if I could wipe away all signs of him. Mom did not stop me. She quietly put a kettle on the stove. The sound of water heating slowly overtook the sound of the rain. That night, sitting behind the house, I heard Mom say to Dad, "That boy cares for the porch like a kid with a new goldfish." Dad chuckled. "Let him be mad. He'll understand tomorrow." They spoke about me like I was someone else and yet also me. My anger softened a bit. I turned away, not wanting to look at the boots standing in the corner of the kitchen. On the fifth rainy afternoon, our neighbor, Mrs. Ruth, stopped by, arms full of flowers, handing Mom a loaf of cornbread. She stood on the porch, saw the boots, and said, "My husband used to have just one pair, too. Where there was mud, there was warmth." She'd been a widow for years, rarely spoke of it, but that day, the words came out naturally like Dad's boots had stirred a deep well. Mom smiled gently. "With this rain, every house is wet." The sentence sounded short, but it carried an unspoken second half. Wet, but warm. I began noticing something new right under the old felt mat. Mom had placed a shallow tin tray with curled edges to catch the water dripping from the soles. At night, the water reflected the dim kitchen light, the bulb, the figures, the boots, like a slow developing photograph floating in water. On the seventh rainy day, Dad sat with an old metal spoon scraping mud from the grooves of the sole. Each clump fell out, leaving ridges, making a sound softer than the rain. He handed me the spoon. "Give it a try." I scraped clumsily. The spoon clicked against a screw. Dad nodded and smiled with his eyes. I knew I had just learned another path on the map of his boots. On the 9th day of rain, the mailman left a soggy flyer in the mailbox. "Shoe repair re-sole patch polish special offer." The paper was damp and limp. Dad glanced at it. "Leave it." Mom folded it and tucked it into the drawer with the scissors and measuring tape. No one brought up taking the boots in. Not because of sentiment, but as if we all silently agreed the boots would live their life our way through every season. On the 11th rainy day, little Billy crawled onto the porch and traced the wet boot prints with his finger, shaping them into a dog, dotting the eyes with grains of sand. He burst into laughter. The laughter warmed the air. Dad stood inside the door, eyes glimmering, hand lifted slightly, as if to pet the drawing from afar, afraid that stepping out would ruin the little dog. On the 13th day, Dad slipped on the porch step. His hand caught the door frame just in time. I rushed over, pulled the boots from his feet, set them on the mat, then scrubbed the step clean with the grumpy old towel. My heart pounded. Dad gave a small nod. That nod said more than a full sentence ever could. That night the rain fell like silk threads. Mom placed a dry cloth beside the boots and a bowl of coarse salt to absorb moisture. I laughed. Every low-income home has its own tricks for fighting dampness. I placed my hand on the boot's collar. It felt cold, but inside still held a hint of the day's warmth. That faint warmth was enough to understand. Not everything dirty is truly unclean. In the sound of rain tapping the roof, I swore I heard slow footsteps from afar. Not boots on cement, but the sound of someone coming home, just like every other day. I closed my eyes. Billy's boot-print dog appeared in my mind, then melted into the spreading puddle. The next morning, the rain had turned to a light drizzle. Dad stepped onto the porch to test the ground. The squelch was faint now, like someone turning down the volume on memory. He turned back inside, crossed the porch, without leaving a trace. Strangely, I felt a small loss, as if a silent lesson had come to an end. He hung up his raincoat, set the boots in the corner, and gently dabbed them with a towel. The familiar gestures suddenly felt like rituals, and I realized I wanted to learn them all over again, but this time with a different heart. By the end of the rainy stretch, the sun broke through. The first rays slanted across the porch like golden butter on a white plate. The musty smell shrank into the corners, making way for the scent of dry fabric. Dad brought the boots outside, to dry half in the sun, half in the shade, afraid strong sunlight would crack them further. I sat beside him, my fingers tracing the jagged edges of the soles, the dried mud crumbling like powdered earth. "Do not pick at it," he said. "Let it fall off on its own." I nodded, thinking of all the things in life that need to fall off on their own to truly let go. That night I asked Mom for an old brush. I knelt on the porch and brushed every edge of the boots, not to make them new, just to remove the rainy shell. Mom placed a bowl of warm soapy water beside me. The soft scrubbing sound was like scratching the back of a gentle animal. Dad walked past, paused for a moment, then kept going. I did not look up. Some things need no words or eye contact to be understood. That night I stared at the boots for a long time. I saw they were clean, in a different way, not polished, but freed from my anger. I finally understood the boots were dirty because they went where we could not, so the floor stayed clean for us to play on, so dinner would stay on the table, even through the rain. That kind of dirt, in the end, is the cleanest kind, the kind born of quiet, patient love that needs no praise. Do you remember a rainy season that changed the rhythm of your whole household? A sound, a smell, a footprint? Share it in the comments. Maybe somewhere in this story you will see your own season of rain. The night after the rain stopped, the porch dried quickly, the cement warm from the sun. I walked outside barefoot and froze for a moment in front of the boots left to dry. On a whim, I pulled one closer and tried slipping it on. My foot slid into the rough, dry lining. The smell of old leather mingled with sunshine like a room that's been closed up too long. The boot's collar hugged my calf, coarse but not uncomfortable. I felt like I was trying on an adult's stride. Putting my weight down on the heel, I realized the boot was heavier than I'd thought. The second one went on slower. The firm edge scraped leather, making a scratching sound. The toe was too long past my foot, leaving space unused, like part of a story not yet written. I took a tentative step. The wooden floorboards creaked thinly, and the boot answered with a heavy, slow thud that forced me to shorten my step so I wouldn't lean forward. The world seemed to slow too. From the porch into the kitchen, I had to count each step, heel, first toe, after body, leaning like I was learning some odd dance. My mother stood in the kitchen door, stirring a pot of soup, laughing, "Come here, cowboy." My face warmed. I tried to act casual. On the third step, the boot's toe caught the rug's edge and I nearly tipped, grabbing the chair. Then Mom and I both burst out laughing. From that moment on, I learned to pull my steps straight before lifting distribute weight. Evenly, listen to the boots to know what they wanted. Funny thing, after only a few steps, I got used to the new rhythm, though that rhythm was not mine. When I turned my foot, I heard a tiny clink inside the boot. I pulled it off, tilted it gently, and a dark brown coin, stuck with dried mud, fell out. I wiped it on my shirt. It showed the outline of a building and a date long past a piece of time Dad had forgotten somewhere. I placed the coin on the sunny doorstep, then pulled the boot back on. Out in the backyard, the cement was dry now, still edged with white salt after the rain. Because the toe was long, every step felt like stepping into another time. I imagined being Dad, dropping my weight to the ground like a promise. At the garden's edge, the smell of rain-soft grass mixed with old leather soothed me oddly. Mom leaned against the doorframe, asking, "Heavy?" I joked, "Like carrying the whole house?" She laughed. "Yes, almost." I tried walking down the narrow hallway just a little off, and the boot's toe scraped the wall scratch like tearing a calendar. I stretched forward to glance at the tip, then tiptoed forward. Never had I moved so slowly in my own home. Billy popped his head in to tease. "You're walking like a robot, Jack." He tapped my boot heel, then ran off his bare feet, quick and clear against the weighted heavy steps of mine, like music with both drums and bells. In the living room, the thick rug muffled the boot's sound almost to nothing. I circled the table, ducked around chairs. My feet in the boots felt like a boat in a slow current. I thought Dad's path must be like that too. Some parts soft, some parts hard, where the smooth bits let you forget your feet and the loud ones remind you to pay attention. I tried walking faster and bumped a table corner. Glass of water rattled. I understood these boots allow no careless leaps. They make you present in every step. Mom called us to lunch. I took off the boots, placed them neatly back. No flipping for water to escape. No stuffing. The liners just returning, borrowed things. Seeing my bare feet so light, I felt something missing a weight I'd just learned. Mom put a plate in front of me, glanced at the boots, nodded slightly. In the afternoon, I tried slipping on one boot again and walked. My back tilted, my right knee working harder. I understood why grown-ups say you need a pair. Shoes, hands, or worries all need pairs too. I took it off, placed it gently. Sundust motes like salt sprinkled on the boot's collar. I blew them away and they drifted in the beam of light, then vanished. I picked up the coin, cool to the touch, put it in my childhood treasure box, by marbles, buttons, rope, scraps, labeling it the boot's coin. Night fell and I thought of tomorrow. Usually Sunday, Dad would take someone out somewhere nearby. In my head, I saw calm water, thin dew, the smell of damp mops. Perhaps the boots hold their own map. The dirt roads always lead back to water. Sunday morning, the air was cool. Dew still clung to the fence. Dad knocked gently on my bedroom door. Voice soft. "Want to go down to the lake for a bit?" I jumped up, eyes landing immediately on the boots, standing in the kitchen corner like two periods at the end of his question. That day, I did not yet know I would remember the smell of algae forever. Only that the sound of his boots on the steps sounded slower, longer, edged with excitement I could not hide. The path to the lake passed through grass, soggy after days of rain, the smell of young mud and damp grass combined. I carried the plastic bait pail. Dad held the old fishing kit box, its lid peeling paint and creaking. His boots had bits of dry algae and fresh mud clinging on. The lake's surface was mirror flat, covered by breaths mist, light dew drifting, breaking into filaments at the shore. On the north bank, earth, soft. Dad stepped down, boots sinking halfway, making a soft squelch. Water leaked around the boot's edge, spreading in circles, then still. He opened the tackle box, wet metal smell rising. A folding knife cut bait, leaving a bright streak on the lid. I sat watching his hands, tie the hook thumb, pinching forefinger, twisting movement practiced like handwriting. The float dropped into the lake plop, ripples spreading, then fading in the mist. Dad handed me the polished bamboo rod, said, "Keep your eye on the float." I nodded, standing straight, never taking my eyes off the water. The wind rustled through the trees, behind us leaves trembling like a whispering choir. I looked down at his boots once more. The edges still held bits of green algae, the mark of him stepping deeper to find firm ground for me. My chest tightened with a feeling I could not yet name. But now, no is gratitude. My grandpa used to fish on the opposite shore, Dad said, still watching the float. He always said, "Don't bait, loudly fish. Get scared." I asked, "Did Grandpa teach you to tie hooks this way?" Dad smiled a crooked smile. He taught me to sit still. Hearing that I tried to sit still like a shadow by the lake, my float bobbed, then I jerked. Too much bait flew into damp grass. Dad did not scold, only helped untangle, saying, "Slow down now." I tried again. The float bobbed in rhythm like breathing. The water rippled, my heart rippled too. Mud rose on his boots up to his ankles. As he shifted his feet, mud cracked in flakes. Someone might have called them dirty boots, but to me they were like two pillars holding Dad steady so his hands were free to tie hooks for me. From then on, I understood Dad did not need new shoes to be dignified. He told short stories, times when he stood so long his legs went numb, thinking a big fish would take the bait only to find algae. Times he saw a deer drinking and held his breath, not daring to move. Each story ended in silence so leaves could speak next. I asked, "Why don't you sit?" He replied, "Standing keeps me warm." I looked at his boots and believed him. While rummaging in the tackle box, wind blew out a little note from inside. I picked it up. It had a half-written line, "Be careful with your hand, so you can..." Mother's writing smudged by moisture. I handed it to Dad. He smiled like a ray of sun breaking through rain, then tucked the note in the box lid. We caught only a few small fish. Dad said enough for lunch, like speaking of a debt paid in full. His boots picked up more algae stains. A tiny leaf stuck. With each step along the lakeshore, the boots made a low, soft bep, sound familiar, like the road already known. Dad does not often say "I love you," but those boots have accompanied him through the quietest mornings so I could grow without lacking. When sunlight pierced the mist, gold spread across the lake's surface, we packed up. Dad lifted the tackle box. I carried the pail. On the walk back, I followed in his footprints, trying to place my steps on ground already trodden. "Step where I stepped," Dad said. I thought it was advice to avoid slipping. Only much later did I understand. It was a way of life. Evening came, the air drying. Dad pulled a wooden chair out to the porch, placed the boots in his lap as though closing the spine of a book. That was the hour of the familiar ritual, repairing the soles. He opened the old tin gearbox, dents and all. Inside a wood-handled box cutter, dull scissors, spool of brown waxed thread, tube of black glue, few cut-out cardboard pieces, wooden clothespin clamps, a stubby pencil. Mom jokingly called it our home shoe repair shop. Dad spread newspaper across the porch, placed the boots on it, pried up the exposed sole. The knife scraped clean the glue, smell sharp and leather damp, warmer even than the heavy quilt. He dried the groove of rainwater, let it dry first. Glue adheres better, he said softly, as if speaking to the boots. He placed a piece of cereal boxboard under the sole, traced around the edge with the pencil, then cut carefully to fit. "Don't seal it too tight, let the foot breathe," he murmured. When he opened the glue tube, the pungent smell burst out. He squeezed a neat bead around the perimeter, spread it evenly, then pressed down hard smack glue, seeping out thin. He laid clothespin clamps around, click, click, like erecting a tiny fence. Excess glue wiped away with paper. His fingers, sticky with glue, cracked, but he only blew gently as though dusting off an old photograph. I asked, "Where did you learn this?" He answered, "From things not worth replacing." The answer dropped onto the porch steady. When he lifted the boots, heart-shaped scrap of board slipped out faint blue writing. "Be careful on the road." Mother's handwriting. Dad smiled, slowly handed it to me, like a ticket to a silent performance where the actor was the boots, the props glue and thread, the soundtrack his rare size. He threaded curved needles, waxed thread, hissed softly through leather and sole snick scissors tension. Each stitch close, slow, weighted like a crude instrument played inside a windy night. When the knot was tied, he held a lighter to melt wax, a sweet scent drifting. Mom brought out tea, reminding, "Don't let moisture get into the glue." They sat together waiting for it to dry in silence. Glue spread into a round stain on the newspaper, night air carrying grass smells, insects chorus. The boots resting between them, clothespin clamps like half-built walls. Mr. Harlan next door dropped off an old but good pair. Dad tried them, took 2 steps, and returned. "They're fine, but I'm used to these." When he left, I asked, "Why not take them?" Dad looked toward the dark yard. "New boots are good, but my feet know the way with the old." I only fully understood those words years later. He removed clamps, pressed edges with his hands, feeling more than seeing. Trimmed excess glue, tapped the sole on the floor, thud the hollow sound, now sealed. He handed it to me heavy, but the kind of weight that makes one feel secure. He cut another piece of board, saying, "For tomorrow's dampness." I asked, "Are you going to buy a new pair of boots?" He looked out into the dim yard. "When these can't walk anymore." I realized repairing boots wasn't just about saving money. It was about saying the things that have walked through the weather deserve another chance. In my house, old things are not thrown away. They are healed with glue, thread, cardboard, and with patience. My father's hands, sticky with thread and wax, are like ink holding my childhood steady. Night fully came. Dad put his repair tools away, placed the boots against the wall like 2 gatekeepers. Before stepping inside, he looked at them, long exhaled. The sigh was not tired, but gentle, like the relief after tightening a stitch. Maybe my father never had enough money to buy new boots, but he always found a way to keep the old ones walking. I touched the toe of the boot, the glue still cool. My ears seemed to echo the scratch of thread, the clamp, click, the stitch dragging, and the quietness of a man learning patience with time. Have you ever repaired something instead of throwing it away? A chair that wobbles, a radio that hisses, or shoes with cracked heels. Tell me how you or someone you know gave it a little more road to walk. The next morning, rummaging through a drawer for thread, I found an old photo tucked between two bills me in a graduation gown, standing beside Dad. He wore a wrinkled shirt, and below the hem of his pants, those same boots. In that moment, I understood why this faded picture still shines brightest in my memory. It had been slipped into an old notebook paper, yellowed like honey, the top corner creased. The photo rustled faintly as I pulled it free. It was square with a thin white border. At the center, me 18 in a black gown cap, tilted in the June breeze. Beside me, slightly behind, stood Dad, his pale blue shirt wrinkled, one hand holding a thin envelope, the other blending into my shadow. On his feet, those boots again. The left toe's scuff caught the late sun like a scar. He wasn't smiling, just calmly present, as if thinking, "After this, let's pick up groceries." Behind us, white folding chairs lined the field, tassels scattered. A song played faintly from the stage, tying the town together. I remember the smell of sun-warmed cloth, fresh paper, cut grass, cheap perfume. I smiled, big, gap-toothed, feeling grown. But in the photo, one small detail bothered me. Then Dad's pant leg didn't fully cover the boot. I remember thinking, I wish he hadn't worn those today. I stood taller, trying to hide a quiet shame. Years later, I see what mattered. Dad's hand gently held the envelope, probably with bills Mom tucked in, just something for later. His shirt sleeve was slightly frayed, the top button undone. And those boots, not polished, not filthy, stood solid, keeping his shadow in place. He didn't smile. He simply stood with quiet pride, letting me be the center. On the back, a faint coffee ring and 4 words in blue ink. Slanted right, stand firm on your own. No signature, but I know his writing steady final. I held the photo to the window. The stain glowed like a tiny sun, the words like a promise. I remember someone joking, "Your old man wore boots to graduation." I smiled through the sting. Dad didn't flinch, asked if I was hungry, said we'd get meat pies, reminded me to keep the diploma safe. He was never one for ceremony, but always perfect in the small things that anchor a day. That afternoon, the photo was slipped into my scholarship folder. I packed in a hurry and didn't look back, but now it rests on my desk, late sunlight warming its edges. I trace his hand in the photo, feeling paper, but remembering his calloused skin. In one corner stands Mr. Sanders, my English teacher, just a shoulder and a striped tie. He once quoted, "Some things are so ordinary they're great." If he saw those boots, he'd nod. He always left silence after finishing a thought, like my father did, letting space say what words can't. I placed the photo back in its envelope and wrote, "The day I thought I was grown, but still had much to learn beside someone who didn't smile." I tucked it in the drawer where I keep small, heavy things. And whenever I see it again, I hear the thud of boots and folding chairs in the warm grass of that afternoon. In your old photos, is there someone beside you who didn't smile, but now you see it was the warmest thing there? Tell me about that photo. I looked at the boots and felt like a chapter of life had just closed. That line arose not to sadden, but like a small headline printed at the bottom of a newspaper page: "This page is done." Flip to another. A few years later, winter again. The yard was white, family gathered inside. When footsteps grew fewer, the house smelled of burning wood, rinse of flowers and the boots, resting there as though part of a body just departed its shadow. On the day we said goodbye to Dad, snow fell fine like chalk dust covering roofs and grass equally. Inside, voices were soft, cups touched plates. Quietly, doors opened and closed gently. Everything was quiet, as though we all feared shattering the silence holding us together. After everyone had left, only family remained, folding chairs, pushed to walls, tablecloths, gathered waste tied in corners. I walked down the hallway, opened the cupboard. The boots were exactly where they always were, but somehow smaller. Not because they had shrunk, but because the house had lost someone to wear them, and the world around felt too wide. Tom said from behind me, maybe we should get rid of them. His voice hoarse from cold and quiet. Billy sat on the floor, finger twisting a button dropped somewhere. Mom stood at the stove ledge, folding a damp handkerchief, moving slowly like an unspoken prayer. Shall I donate them, someone raised, neighbor or relative? The question hung in the house like a dry leaf hanging on a thread. I want to keep them, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. No one objected, yet I still felt the need to add, not to wear, just to have them there. I could not find the exact words, so I stopped. Tom looked at me, nodded. Billy gave a thin smile as though he had guessed. I carried the boots to the table, placed them there. Late afternoon light slid over their toes, revealing scuff marks like lines in a palm. Under the soles, old mud had turned to dust, settled into a fine gray coat. I took a dry cloth and wiped them. Dust lifted in a small dreamlike cloud, then vanished. The smell of old leather rose immediately, one of those smells not of an object, but of time lived inside an object. Mother sat on a chair near the table, her hand resting lightly on the boot collar, as if putting her hand on an absent arm. She did not cry. Her tears seemed already shed elsewhere that day. When I lifted the tongue of one boot, I found stuck inside a small paper fragment the size of 2 fingers, yellowed and spotted, corner torn. I pulled it out, unfolded. It was a thin cut of cardboard. From a food box, on it a pencil-drawn line marking foot length and 3 numbers, 27, 10, 9. 27 perhaps, the measurement in some unit 10 and 9, maybe past notes, no words, just marks and numbers. I looked at them like looking at footprints in sand, distinct, simple, but enough to shake something deep. Perhaps Dad once measured his foot for a liner. Perhaps he planned something he never got to. I tucked the cardboard in my wallet, not to hold money, but to hold another measure of love. I found an old wooden box, a photo box lined with soft cotton. I placed the 2 boots and they tapped together faintly, then lay still. In a desk drawer, I found Dad's wristwatch that no longer ran its glass, scratched diagonally its leather strap, as dark as the boots. I set it between the collars, back to back. Some things, when placed beside each other, stop being lonely. I closed the lid but left it unlocked, so that the wind could still pass through. No one understands why I keep something so worn. But it is not the boots. It is the silhouette of a father. When I spoke that, I felt my shoulders drop half an inch. The wall before me receded. I no longer needed to explain. I only needed to place this box at just the right height, not to display like a medal nor hide like shame. On the bookshelf among the books whose spines are worn, there is space. Mrs. Ruth, leaning on her cane, visited, bringing warm apple pie. She looked at the wooden box, asked softly, "You are keeping them?" I nodded. She told me that her husband had a pair of boots too. She kept them until her hand could no longer lift. When I need to speak with him, I open the box. She smiled, eyes playful with tears. I looked at the box. I thought, I will open it when I need it. Not to say grand things, just to hear again that faint thud inside. That evening the house was empty. Wind slipped through crack of door, carried the scent of snow into the room. I opened the box. Old leather met the smell of night, mixing into a fragrance, both strange and familiar. I touched my fingertip to the ridged edges of soles, remembering the feeling from seasons past. In that still moment, memory walks, by foot, not needing sound system, not needing stage. I saw the porch steps, the misty lake, the grass field, the stadium yard, the threshold, open for a season without boots. I used to think I would forget, but each time I see the boots, I see Dad going somewhere around here. Not far. Sometimes just across the kitchen, pausing for one beat at the low chair or glancing out the porch to see if rain is coming. Sometimes stepping outside the door where the porch expects that downward step. The boot's thud is gone, but I hear that rhythm in my heart, steady, slow, sure, like a song without words. I closed the box, placed it on the shelf. On the lid, I stuck a small note, open when missing. Beneath, in smaller letters, "Be careful of your hand, so you can but." I copied the faded fragment of Mother's old words, leaving the sentence unfinished so all that is still undone has a place to rest. I turned off the light. In darkness, the house breathes quietly. I know from now on, just touching this box, I will hear steps of someone who has left, but somehow remains. Late at night, I sit organizing old lesson plans, the job that has been with me half my life, and realize there is one lesson never written. There are things adults teach children more by their shoes than by their words. In the morning, I will tell my old students, if I ever see them again, about another essay, the essay of footsteps. I taught almost 40 years, chalk dust on sleeves, like summer dust on the hands of someone mowing grass. I talk about literature, about putting full stops, about reading a passage to hear breathing between lines. But there is one lesson I have never spoken in class, the lesson of how a person walks. On school mornings, when the announcement roll is read over the loudspeaker, I stand in the hallway watching students pass by. One student's pristine sneakers, another's worn sole shoes. Some walk loudly like drums. Some tread lightly, like afraid to stir chalk dust on the board. I grade papers, return essays, scold tardiness, everything by procedure, like the school clock ticking. Yet the story of my father's boots, I keep for myself a hard candy in my pocket, seldom brought out to be tasted slowly. Perhaps only when I retire will I have courage to say, that taciturn man taught me by every step he took. I wrote that in my notebook after the farewell party with colleagues among flowers and hugs. My handwriting trembled slightly, not because my hand was old, but because I was placing it in a spot I always avoided under the gaze of others. At school, I once met a 7th grader named Aaron. He often came late, not from laziness, I guessed, but because he walked slowly. One foggy morning, I saw him on the sidewalk bending to retie his shoelace with clear tape. I stepped forward to give him a marker, told him to head to class. First, I would fix the lace after. Under the teacher's desk lay a roll of tape beside the spool of chalk rope. I cut a piece wrapped the toe of his shoe. My hand moved from memory of old porch evenings, measure press smooth, as though repeating a nameless ritual. Aaron looked up. "You can fix it, teacher." I smiled. I know how to tend. He did not fully understand. I did not explain further. At the end of term, Aaron left a folded note in my desk. Inside was one sentence in unsteady letters: I will walk slow, but I will arrive. No signature, but I recognized the handwriting, those L letters stretched like someone stepping. I slipped the note into the grade book beside his name, and it has stayed there many years. I have developed a habit before each lesson telling a short story. A lost bird returning to the schoolyard. A March wind that falls leaves a girl bringing library books, late, but coming back apologetically. I've never told the story of the afternoon when Dad's boot sole fell off in the yard. I fear I would talk too long, or my voice would crack had he bent over, picked it up, so I remain silent. I leave that lesson under a layer of chalk dust, like a word written and erased, yet chalk still smears on the board, only those who look closely may see. Once I brought students out to the backyard to see the old brick wall I wanted to teach texture in a descriptive writing lesson. Walking the gravel path, I heard their shoes scruffle, fix their pace. I walked more slowly. One asked, "Are you tired, teacher?" I said, "No, I'm listening." Listening to wind leaves pebbles, and somewhere the sound of boots from a past still beating softly beneath my heart. I think if I had told that day, I would say, "Do not fear being slow. Slow but steady, you will get there in your way." At age 62, a former student came back to visit. He works at the town's machine shop. He gifted me a pair of dark leather gloves, saying, "Put these on so your hands are warm when cutting the grass." I smiled. He sat on the porch, eyes following a ray of light across the floor, then showed me a photo, him in steel-toe boots, standing beside a lathe. "We started early, teacher," he said. I nodded, not saying that I have known very early since hearing my father's boots. Before leaving, he paused at the door, looked at the corner cupboard where I kept the wooden box. "What do you have in there so carefully?" "Teacher," he teased. I said, "A lesson I have not yet taught them." In those final days before I retired, I wiped the board more slowly, the edge of my shirt brushing chalk dust, leaving a streak of light. I watched the children laughing outside in new shoes full of color and wished they would know in a way words cannot that resilience has a color too, just a color that never fades. I returned to my room, opened my desk drawer, saw Aaron's note still there, the paper soft. I touched it. "Walk slow, but you will arrive." I smiled, telling myself, that is the lesson your father taught you by his boots. At farewell ceremony, they asked me to say a few words. I looked down at my hands, saw veins fine as waxed thread of years past. I told them of a literature teacher who did not know how to say goodbye properly, so he left his students a picture muddy road after rain, overlapping footprints, each size different, but all heading toward the same small town where someone waited for dinner. I stopped there. I did not mention the boots. Yet when I stepped down, I realized I was walking in his rhythm. Slow, sure, unhurried. Night fell slowly. I sat alone, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. In the stillness, the image of that boot sole falling in the yard came back to me, a soft pop. A man bending down to pick it up and then quietly walking on. That is the story I want to end tonight, not to feel sad, but to feel light. Some things we think are objects, but they are actually people. That pair of boots in the wooden box is one of those things. When I place my hand on the lid, I am not just touching leather glue or stitching. I am touching a foggy morning, a wet step, a graduation photo, and a winter where cloth slippers took the place of boots. All of it comes together into one thing, the way a man walked through his life. The tears, the glue, lines, the stitches. They might look worn and ugly to the eye, but when I place my hand on them, they tell stories of hills. He pushed an old bicycle up of evenings. He walked through the rain so the family could have a warm dinner. I grew up on a floor that was sometimes wet but never cold. I do not want to turn those boots into some grand symbol. Every home has an object like that, old clunky worth nothing, but the moment it is gone, the house suddenly feels empty. For some, it is a faded cap. For others, a hammer or a broken radio. For me, it was a pair of boots worn until the soles finally gave out. I am not keeping them to hold on to my father. I am keeping them to learn how to walk through the rest of my life, to walk slowly when someone needs me to walk steadily when someone needs a shoulder, and to know when to stop so I do not get in anyone's way. A lesson meant for the feet, it turns out, was really for the heart. I imagine one day my own son might open the box. He will see an ugly pair of boots, their scent faded. I only hope he lays his hand on them and stays still for a few minutes. Maybe, just maybe, he will hear the voices of the men in this house. His grandfather standing on the porch, his father nervously tying the laces for the first time, and himself on a morning not yet come tightening the knots with all the patience he has. If tonight you open your closet and touch something you have not used in a while, pause for a moment and ask, "Where have you gone with me?" Maybe it will answer through scratches, through fading, through its scent, or through the way it rests gently in your hand, just like the boots now resting quietly in my wooden box. I am not here to tell you to keep or to let go. I only know that ever since I wrapped up those boots and placed them in a box, the house feels less drafty. I open the box when I miss him, close it when I feel full, and each time I feel a little lighter. The night is quiet now. The wooden box sits there, the label Dad's Boots, leaning under the warm yellow light. I turn off the light and listen to the house breathe. In the dark, I take slow steps. Each step is a quiet thank you to the man who wore that old pair of boots until the soles fell off and still kept walking. If this story touched you in some way, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment sharing about an item you have held onto as a memory. I would truly love to hear your story. Thank you for spending your time listening. I will see you again in the next story.